Good morning and welcome to Fairfax Community Church. We got off to a great start last night and I'm pleased to see that you're back again with us today. I had the privilege of being at IGE at the creation of the organization and have been involved with the Institute for a long time. My name is Al McDonald. I'm the pastor of Global Engagement here at Fairfax Community Church. You'll notice a certain similarity between my title and the Institute for Global Engagement. IGE attracts the best and the brightest of young scholars who take scholarship and their faith very seriously. And Josh White is one of those who combines a very informed faith and serious scholarship. Josh is a research fellow at IGE and a sometime student at SAIS, the School of Advanced and International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. A few months ago, Josh wrote a piece for Christianity Today on his experience in the Northwest, spending 7 months in the Northwest frontier province of Pakistan. And I was particularly interested in the subsequent months to see the letters to the editor in reaction to Josh's piece. And there was one there that talked about how naive Josh was to come to the conclusions he did based on his experience. And I think that the writer of this letter got the innocent of doves part that Ambassador Seipel talked about last night, but missed the wise as serpents. Josh is a very astute observer. He is informed about Islam and the context in northwest Pakistan where he lived. We're privileged to have Josh with us this morning to share some of his experience. And so I would like us to welcome now Josh White. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Alan, for the great introduction. And it's really good to be with you here this morning. And I had the pleasure of sitting kind of out in the back there last night, listening to the discussion last night. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Before we get to our discussion this morning, our kind of panel, fireside chat, the view, whatever this format represents, I want to reflect with you a little bit about why we're here this morning talking about our identities as Christians and why we felt that it was important as a part of that to have a panel with two American Muslims. Why do we think that contributes to our discussion about our own identities? If you're like me, you might have been to a lot of Christian conferences, and I know it's not the typical thing to have the morning session with Muslim speakers. But I want to share with you why I think it's incumbent upon all of us, especially those of us who call ourselves evangelicals, to hear their voices and to hear them for what they are and to hear them for what they can tell us about who we are as believers. First of all, in order to allay some of your fears and maybe some of their fears, I want to let you know up front that I'm not going to ask them to provide their expert hermeneutical insight into the deepest and most esoteric questions of our Christian scriptural tradition, which is probably something we should all be grateful for. I'm not going to ask them in this forum to critique the tenets of our faith, just as this is not a forum in which we're here to critique the tenets of theirs. And I'm not going to ask them to dwell only on our points of commonality, ignoring the areas where we might have religious differences or where our communities might sometimes come into conflict. I'm not going to ask them for any of those things, but I am going to ask them to share their voice because I think that we have at least three good reasons to be listening to Islamic voices on these questions of faith and identity and essentially why we're here this morning, why we're taking a perfectly good Saturday morning to be here and considering these questions. I first encountered the Muslim world in a serious way in 2005 when I spent almost a year living in northwest Pakistan. And as some of you might know, it was a very strange kind of arrangement, the way it all developed. IGE initiated a dialogue with the chief minister of the Frontier Province, which is a province of about 20 million people, predominantly ethnic Pashtun, which is one of the largest tribal societies in the world. And it borders Afghanistan. And this is an area which is, in many ways, the birthplace of the Taliban, the birthplace of Al-Qaeda, but is also a place with some of the most hospitable people I've ever met anywhere. And the chief minister was, and still is, the representative of an Islamist political alliance that had swept into power in the year 2002 on a strong wave of anti-American feeling and a strong platform in favor of the Sharia law. And we initiated this dialogue with the help of Dr. Zia Mahmood, who is here today. We initiated this dialogue because we were concerned about the promulgation of a new Sharia law called the Hasba Bill in this province, which could have really disadvantaged women and religious minorities, and it's something that many people were concerned about. So at our invitation, the chief minister of the province came to Washington, D.C. As our guest for about 10 days. And I remember that time as pretty much the most surreal 10 days of my life. We discussed Islamic law. We discussed religious and political issues in America and Pakistan. We spent our days walking to see the monuments on the National Mall and eating Haagen-Dazs next to the Washington Monument. And I took his sons to the IMAX at the Air and Space Museum. And after our days of official meetings, the government and the think tanks, we hit up what seemed to be just about every Pakistani restaurant in the D.C. metro area. So I became intimately familiar with the people and with the cuisine. And after this trip, he invited us to Peshawar to see the Frontier Province for ourselves. And we did. Chris Seifel led our small delegation. And after our time there, I actually stayed around there for about a year. And I was studying. I traveled around the frontier and all around Pakistan. I sat on people's floors and had more cups of tea than I could possibly count. And spent time with students, spent time at government functions, and even spent a memorable afternoon pheasant hunting in the tribal areas with the mullahs, which then qualified as the most surreal moment of my life, without question. Being in Pakistan, I soon discovered that Pakistani Islam and Islam in general was not quite what I expected it to be. And I think, quite forgivably, Christians in America put Islam into a rather small box. Islam, we say, is like this. And I found, even after being there for just a few months, that I couldn't put Islam into a box, much less a very small little box. And to my mind, this is the first reason why we need to listen to Islamic voices. Because Islam is far from being a monolith, and it has the same diversity in its traditions and in its history as we do as Christians. And of course, traditions can arise over any number of things. Traditions can arise over theological differences. They can arise over cultural differences, over major political events. But in many ways, so often, a tradition simply represents a distinct way of navigating our different set of identities. Our identities, our religious and our theological identity, our global or our essentially human identity that we're talking about here, and our national or our patriotic identity. And I have friends, and you may as well, who are pacifist Quakers. And I have friends who are self-professed premillennial dispensationalist fundamentalists. And I have friends who are Episcopalian but not Anglican, and others who are Anglican but not Episcopalian, and others who think they're Episcopalian and Anglican but can only commit to being so through the next Lambeth conference, and then they'll get back to me and see if any of that has changed. We're all familiar with this tremendous diversity that we have within the Christian tradition and the ways in which we've managed around a very strong core of shared beliefs to form different traditions and different ways of expressing these three allegiances that we're talking about this weekend. And the same, I think, is true within Islam. And I found that even within Pakistan, even within one country, I was amazed at what I found. It's similar to America. I found that, of course, many Muslims are simply Muslims by culture, just as many Americans are sort of Christians by default because they were born here and they go to church now and then. But many, many others were quietly devout and were committed to interpreting the Quran through their tradition and through their own reading of the text. Others I found in Pakistan were in the Sufi tradition, or in South Asia what they call the Barelvi tradition. And these are people who are seeking a more experiential or even a more mystical faith. And I remember going to an event that was, I had gotten to know someone in Karachi who was a friend of one of our speakers here today. And her grandmother had organized this extraordinary evening in Karachi, in southern Pakistan. And it was an evening in devotion to the Prophet Muhammad. And there was singing, and there was conversation, and people would come up to the front and take the microphone and with emotion in their voice share about how Allah had changed their heart. And, aside from the fact that there were no guys sitting up front strumming acoustic guitars and shaking those little plastic eggs, it could have been any charismatic Christian worship event. It was very extraordinary and very moving to me at least the surface similarity to these kind of experiences. Other Pakistanis I met were Deobandis, who come from they have a strict reading of the text, but they trace their roots to a very incredible revivalist tradition in India. After 1857, after there was a failed revolt against the British, the Muslim community had a profound crisis of identity. And out of that identity and out of those questions of how do we be Muslims in the world now, this very strong tradition emerged, which continues to the present day. Others were Wahhabis, which you might have heard about from the Saudi Arabian tradition, which tends to be rather strict and with an Arab flavor. Others were from the Jamaat-e-Islami, who were very ideological. And whenever I would meet with somebody from the Jamaat, it seemed like they had a vision that extended from today until the end of the world. They had an idea about what they wanted to create in terms of an Islamic society and Islamic global order. And others were Tabligis, who generally eschewed politics and spent time every year going out into the countryside, knocking on doors, going door to door, calling Muslims back to the fundamentals of their own faith. And in many ways, the Tabligis represented probably the closest analog to the evangelical tradition in America, but it was a group that I had never heard of until I had gotten to Pakistan. And what about the extremists? I haven't mentioned the extremists. Well, there are Islamic extremists in Pakistan, and I was at the Lal Masjid, at the Red Mosque in Islamabad in late July, and you might have been reading about this in the newspapers. I went to the mosque for Friday prayers there, the day that it opened back up, the day the government opened it up, after the army commandos had stormed the mosque several days earlier, killed scores of students who were armed to the teeth, and killed their leader, Abdul Rashid Ghazi. And this happened right in downtown Islamabad and really came as a shock to Pakistanis everywhere, that this could happen just blocks from the headquarters of the security services. But I stood that Friday on a huge pile of rubble, which until a few days before had been the adjoining madrasa to the mosque. And I watched students in this scene of total chaos retake the mosque, hoist the flag of jihad onto the top of the mosque, bring out their buckets of red paint to recolor the red mosque red, and stand in a mob on the top of the mosque, screaming at the top of their lungs, "Ghazi, Ghazi, from your blood the revolution will come." It was the sort of moment that C&M producers just die for. And that in and of itself was enough of a clue that perhaps I should be making my way out. And I did. I left right before the tear gas was fired. But as I was exiting through the rows of the riot police, who were very tense riot police at that point, it got me to thinking, is this really a picture of Islam? Is this Islam at all? And even the friends who I was with that day, these are friends who honestly feel sympathy for the Taliban. These are friends who have a lot of grievances against America. These are friends who would never consider themselves a progressive Muslim in any sense. Even these friends were horrified and really embarrassed by what they had seen that day. And they made a point to tell me over and over, that wasn't Islam. And I want to tell you that wasn't right. And as evangelicals, I think we need to hear Islamic voices so that the CNN moments, these flashes of something that seems newsworthy, that come into our experience and then quickly vanish, don't blind us to the fact that the Islamic tradition is very rich and very diverse, and that, in fact, the Lal Masjid and Abdul Rashid Ghazi probably represent Islam just about as much as the Branch Davidians and David Koresh represent any of us who call ourselves Christians here in this room. And so even within the experience of one country, it really showed me the way in which the vast majority of Muslims are wrestling within their own Islamic tradition about these very core questions of identity and these very core questions about how to bring their faith into the world around them. The second, and I think it's a related point, we need to hear from Muslim voices because Christians and Muslims are facing many of the very same perennial questions, the same issues about religion and politics. I spent a long afternoon in June in the Senate chambers of the Pakistani Parliament with someone named Professor Senator Khurshid Ahmed, who's the Vice Emir, the number 2 person in the Jamaat-e-Islami of Pakistan, which is the largest, the oldest, and the most influential Islamic political party in Pakistan. And we had some pulao and some chicken, and surrounded by his senator friends, we had a little debate over something quite inconsequential. The topic was, what makes people good? What makes people good? And the tradition of the Jamaat is founded in the thinking of Maulana Maududi, who was an Indian Islamic intellectual. And he has what I would call the outside-in theory of how people change. First, you have to reorient the state and the apparatus toward being good, and then people will eventually become good. There are other views, though, within the Islamic tradition, people like the Tablighis and many others, who have a more inside-out view of how people change. They say first you have to change somebody's heart. You have to change their disciplines. You have to change their practice. You have to change their devotions. You do it for the individual. You do it for the family. And then, only then, will society and the state begin to reflect those values. Now, does this debate sound familiar at all? Does it sound familiar to us? Because it very much should. Because this is a debate that runs right through the heart of the evangelical tradition and the evangelical thinking about our role in the world. We have political activism on the one side, and we have pietism on the other side. We have these questions that go back 200 years and more about how we reconcile our identity, our patriotic identity as Americans, with our citizenship that is in heaven. And Jesus inaugurated, what did he inaugurate? He inaugurated a new kingdom, a new kind of identity for us. And it was a kingdom that was not from this world and not of this world. Now, I happen to be, and you may be as well, more of an inside-out kind of person. I'm the sort of person who gets wary when somebody says, if only the government did such and such, everything would be better. But the point is that this debate very much transcends our own tradition. And wrestling with this question very much transcends the place from which we stand. And I think we have, quite possibly, a lot to learn from the Muslim community and from their history, good, bad, and indifferent, with wrestling with these very same questions about religion and politics, and about how to bring religion into social life. We often hear Christians saying in kind of a triumphalist way, well, we've had our Reformation, and we're still kind of waiting on theirs, right? And I think that this is not only kind of silly, but it ignores so much of the history, not only of what happened before the Christian Reformation, but what happened after the Reformation. And these decades upon decades of wars of religion, and the very checkered history of how Christians related with the Muslim world, all came after what we consider to be our formative experience in wrestling with some of these profound questions. And so I think we need a profound humility in looking at this question and could gain a lot from speaking to Muslims about these issues. Third, and to close, I think we need to listen to Muslim voices because in spite of our very real theological differences and sometimes very real political differences, we often have, in many ways, similar impulses. We believe, as a matter of faith, that religion is not simply a system of private preferences. It's not like which chocolate you prefer. That it goes much deeper than that, and it is not simply an individual, completely private kind of question. We also believe that the sovereignty of God should be expressed, at least in some way, in our social life together, through social justice, through political equality, through all of these things that matter to us, or should matter to us very much as Christians. And we also believe, in a way that sometimes strikes contemporary listeners as odd or terribly scary, that we have stories to tell. And not only stories that are worth sharing, but revelations that are worth sharing. And that, in fact, these aren't just stories and revelations, but that somehow these stories have a bearing on history itself. And that's what we claim as Christians, and that's, in a sense, what Muslims claim. And it strikes the world as something very odd. And we believe, in addition, as modern people, that secularism really can't answer some of the fundamental questions of our time. Particularly these questions we're discussing this weekend about identity and allegiance and obligation. The modern world doesn't have a lot to say to that. When I wrote in my Christianity Today piece that I often felt very comfortable in an Islamic society precisely because it was Islamic and precisely because it was religious, the reaction in some quarters was, and here I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, oh great, the fundamentalists like each other. Now we're screwed. Right? But that's not what I was getting at. It's not as if there is the Christianists are getting together with the Islamists, forming some sort of reactionary co-belligerency against this suffering onslaught of modernity, and we're kind of hanging on against the world. That's not it at all. All I'm saying, and all I want you to hear, is that I think that the vast majority of devout Christians would get along quite well, thank you, with the vast majority of devout Muslims in the world. And not just in a fuzzy kind of children of Abraham, kumbaya-ish kind of way, but in addressing the very kind of questions that we're talking about here today. These questions of faith, questions of identity, questions of religion and politics. We have so many shared impulses. And the more time I spend around my Muslim friends and in a Muslim context, the more I realize that in spite of very real theological and sometimes political differences, these shared impulses are very powerful and are the kind of impulses that we need to understand and to explore together. Jesus said, and of course not just said, but commanded in a rather strong way, to love your neighbor as yourself. And as far as I'm concerned, Muslims, probably today more than ever, constitute our religious neighbors, they constitute our global neighbors, and they constitute our American neighbors. And that's why I believe we should be so honored to have Hadia and Ahmed with us today.